Thanks again for having me. And in a sense, what I'm going to do today is a little bit of a continuation, or rather fleshing out a particular area that I had been talking about a few weeks back when I talked more generally about the history of Islam and Muslims in Tamil Nadu. And since this is a talk about literature, let us straight jump in with a poem. Saiva Madhavan Nagayar Sirpada Cheharame. Saivana Madhava Nagayar Sirpada Cheharame. Saivana Madhava Nagayar Sirpada Cheharame. Saivana Madhava Nagayar Sirpada Cheharame. Now, you might ask, what kind of poem is this? There are 4 lines, they're all apparently identical. But of course, if you're a little bit schooled, and I guess talking to people in India, you are far more knowledgeable about this than it would be if I was talking to an audience in Europe. You might recognize that this is actually meant to be something far more complex than simply repeating 4 times the same line. What you're supposed to do is to scan the lines and then each time separate the words at a different point or interpret the words a little bit differently. And what you get ultimately, if you're skilled in this, or if you are lucky, as I am in this case, and you have the author's explanation of that particular verse at hand, then you might actually come up with a solution and a meaning to that verse. And this is a stylistic device which in Sanskrit is known as yamaka and which in Tamil is known as madak. And if you ultimately then are able to translate this poem, this is roughly what you get. Young lords, swollen with the goddess of wealth, red-clad. Poets, silver-tongued, pruning defects of rhythm and phrase. Here are their crowns, adorned, embellished. Spread by the prosperous lotus-red hands of the just, sapping the strength of troublesome beasts, lie the fields and groves of Nagur, home to the great ascetic. There is his worthy pair of feet. So when you read this poem, what you get is a poem very typical of Indian panegyric traditions of praise, of hymns devoted to gods and saints. On the one side, you have a group of elite people, you might say, the rich and the poets, wearing crowns, red-clad, silver-tongued, etc. And on the other side, you have a saintly individual called here the great ascetic or greatly ascetic, Mahatapa. And as such, this is not a particularly noteworthy poem. So the rich, everyone has to ultimately bow their heads, their crowned heads, at the feet of this important person. But if you know the Tamil country a little bit, and if you look at the name of the author, you spot something. The name of the author is obviously a Muslim name, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Labai. And the town that is mentioned where this great ascetic lives, and whose resident the man is identified, Nagur, is something like the Ajmer of Tamil Nadu, which has the largest dargah of all the dargahs in Tamil Nadu. It's the most important center of what you might call devotional Islam in the state. And you realize that despite the fact that you are having a verse here, which is very typical of a certain type of, let's say, Hindu bhakti tradition, is actually here addressed to a Muslim saint. And this is, in a sense, what I want to talk about mostly in this talk today. A literary tradition by Muslims addressing topics connected to the religion of Islam, but totally couched in an idiom that draws on typical, mostly Sanskritic, we might say, devices for expressing its own religious and non-religious aims. And this verse is really a perfect starter for that. For not only are we presented with a perfect example of how these verses look aesthetically, we are also presented with an example, or with the important cast of characters, you might say, for the story that I'm going to tell. Not only do we have a Muslim wali or saint mentioned here, but we do have the 2 other and perhaps even more important for our purposes, people in the poem. We have the rich people who actually can finance high quality poetry, because all this high quality poetry was not written because people just wanted to write, it was written because people paid for it. And then, of course, you have the poets. Without the poets, no poetry. That's a pretty simple idea. So let me jump straight into some basic ideas about what I'm going to talk about in the next half an hour, 45 minutes. So the basic question is, what is the connection between Islam and the Tamil literary tradition? And this sort of raises two questions immediately. The first is the question about Islam itself. Why should we be particularly concerned in this context about Islam? And what, in fact, do we call Islam in this context? So, and how far does it make sense to highlight religion when we actually talk about poetry, when we talk about texts? Shouldn't we simply assume that poetry is something that has no religion, so to speak? And if religion somehow comes up, it is something incidental, it is not something fundamental to it. Another question that comes up is the question of what actually counts as Islamic. If you just think back to the verse I quoted at the outset, some of you may have noticed that phrase that the young men were swollen with the goddess of wealth. So there is a mention of a Hindu goddess in this poem. Is that, some people might ask, actually Islamic? And people have asked these questions and very often have tended to ignore poetry such as this when they talked about the history of Islam, because they would say, but that's not properly Islamic. But the biggest issue that we have, and one of the reasons why I have made this as one of the focus points of my own research, is that we have this tendency in India to assume that the only proper Islamic literary culture that can be there in India somehow has to look like Arabic or at least Persian literature, that we would expect any form of properly Islamic engagement with literature in India to consist of ghazals or to consist of all the kind of genres that we know from, especially from Urdu literature. And the moment we come across something like the verse I have just quoted, we have this tendency to say, that's not really Islam. That's maybe only half Islam. Maybe he was ignorant, despite the fact that he was obviously learned enough to produce a complicated verse like this. Or maybe he couldn't find any other way to express himself, or something like that. So these are all questions that tend to come up very much when one asks about that relationship between Islam and the Tamil literary tradition, and why it is so important for me to actually talk about this and say, no, actually, Islam plays a very fundamental role in this literature. Now, that brings us to the other side that we very briefly have to mention, and that is the question of what exactly is literature. So, in this talk, I do distinguish two types of writing. One is writing in general. That could be anything. It could be a shopping list. It could be an instruction manual for your TV, right? It could be so many things. We are in our modern society constantly writing for didactic purposes, for documentary purposes. So for instructing people or for memorizing things, for documenting things. But there is a particular way of writing that goes beyond that. And that is writing in accordance to certain aesthetic standards, certain aesthetic aims, which is supposed to give some kind of aesthetic pleasure. And this is what in Tamil would have been called in earlier days and as well as today, Ilakyam, which in many Indian languages is known as Kavya, and which I will call here literature with a capital L, right? That is why the capital L is there. It's not that I've forgotten to put a small L. It is really meant to be literature with a capital L. It's not just any text, but these are texts which are composed according to rules and which have a literary aim that goes beyond any aim at telling you a story or conveying certain information to you. That is an aesthetic aim. Both kinds of writings are actually employed for expressing Islam in Tamil. And I will touch on both kinds of writings. And sometimes it's actually not very easy to distinguish the two, but nevertheless, it makes a certain sense to keep them separate. The last point is I will talk here predominantly about texts and literature as a social practice. I will not really very much talk about individual texts because my experience is if I mention too many individual texts or explain to you what they are and who the authors are, you get lost in a forest of names. And ultimately, after 5 minutes, will have become thoroughly confused about what is he talking about. What I here predominantly will talk about is rather how within Muslim society in Tamil Nadu these Tamil literary and non-literary texts actually functioned and what role the people who produced those texts actually played in society and still play in society, because I will try to bring at the end the story to the present day. Now, this also means that we have to ask ourselves, what are the actual social conditions that produce writing and that produce literature? Neither writing nor literature are given in any language. For the vast majority of the history of mankind, there was no writing. Simple and plain. And when people started inventing it in the very beginning, only a very small number of people actually knew how to read and write. And in many parts of the world, this is a situation that continued till the 19th, maybe even the early 20th century. It was not necessary for the vast majority of people on the planet to know writing in order to live their lives. And it was even less necessary for them to use writing in an aesthetic manner to produce literature. So we actually have to ask ourselves the question, A, why do people start writing and why do people start composing literature in a particular idiom? And even when they do that, because we know Tamil literature is one of the oldest literatures, not only in India, but in the world at large. Um, so not only do we have to ask, why did Tamil literature at one point start? But the question we also have to ask is, why did Muslims at one point get the idea that they should contribute to that literature, that they should write something about things that are important to them in that particular language and that particular literary environment? So people usually tend to write because they either, as I've said, want to document something, and that is as true for a shopping list as it is, say, for the register of a tax payment, or because they want to teach something, they want to transmit knowledge, right? Whereas people compose literature for rather different reasons. They do compose literature because they want to cause certain feelings, certain emotions in their audiences through aesthetic writing. They may also want to compose literature because they want to display their skill, because not everyone can write literature. Most people who can write a shopping list. But in order to produce literature, and especially literature of the type that I've shown you at the beginning or that you see here on the right-hand side in this Chitrakavi image poem style, that requires a lot of training. As a result, like everything that requires training, it tends to socially elevate both the subject of what you're talking about, as well as the people who participate in the creation act of this literary work. And the final thing that is often there that I will only touch upon briefly, but that you still should keep in mind, is what you might call the magic of literature. Literature very often is also seen and felt as being transformative, that you can achieve things with literature, that you can say things, truths with literature that you cannot easily say through ordinary, normal words when you just try to convey some information. So this brings us to the question then, why and how and when did Muslims start writing in Tamil? And this is part of a story that I've been telling in the last talk that I gave, I think 3 or 4 weeks back, of how a diasporic community of Arab and Persian traders slowly in the course mostly of the 14th, 15th century come to be locally settled, start using Tamil first for their documentary purposes, and then by the end of the 16th century start composing Tamil literature. And for this, let us go straight into the beginnings. When you look at any work that talks about this Islamic Tamil literary tradition, you will generally be told that the first poem that we know of, that in any case can be quoted maybe in the context of Islam in Tamil literature, is a poem referred to as the Palchanda Male. Now, Palchandamale is not really a title. Palchandamale is a particular type of poem. And the poem that we are referring to here, we don't even have the complete poem. Rather, this is a poem which is quoted in a treatise probably written in the 14th century by the name of Khaki. This is a treatise that talks about different situations that people imagine happen in love and about which you can write love poetry. And with every situation, the treatise gives a verse as an example. And it quotes this Palchanda Male 8 times. And the interesting thing about this Palchanda Male is that it was a poem written in honor of a man called Vinnan. And Vinnan is not a local South Indian man. He is several times in the poem referred to as a Yavana. So he is from somewhere in the West, most likely in Western Asia. And in one verse, incidentally, probably the last verse of the poem that we know, we can actually see that Vinnan and his followers, in all likelihood, were Muslims. And this is the verse. You, and this is addressed to a couple, a pair of lovers. You and the girl with the bow-like forehead, may you reach now the paradisiacal country surrounded by paddy fields, where the most virtuous people stay, where the Yavanas from across the 7 big oceans, who know all successes or tricks, slightly underhanded compliment, come to worship in the manner of eternal truth when Allah is uttered. So, of course, also Arab Christians and Jews use the word Allah, so we cannot be 100% sure that these Yavanas who are mentioned here were Muslims. But all of this fits rather well with the situation in the Pandya country in the 13th century, which I've talked about in my last talk, that the Pandya kings supported traders, mostly horse traders, from the Middle East very strongly because they needed the horses for their army. And there was a very close connection between the Pandya royal court and a couple of important Middle Eastern merchants and themselves partly members of royalty in some small kingdoms in the Persian Gulf. So most likely what we have here in this poem is the fact that one of these Arabs or Persians who was at the Pandya court got the idea of actually paying a local poet, who in all likelihood was not a Muslim, to write a poem in praise of himself. And this, in all likelihood, is what caused the Palchanda Male to be composed and how it ended up in this poetic treatise, because that is the only Muslim poem that is ever quoted by a non-Muslim prior to the 19th century, right? Now, in the period after this time when these Arab and Persian merchants were there at the Pandya court, we have a situation where Muslims sort of experienced a period of, you might call it provincialization, where they were more or less not cut off, but not as closely connected to the Middle East anymore as they had been before. And in the 15th century, about the 1460s, we find the first evidence of Muslims actually writing in Tamil. And these, interestingly enough, are tombstones. Tombstones written, inscribed in Tamil, and I've shown some example the last time, that record the death of a Muslim person and are found on graveyards surrounding mosques and dargahs. And ultimately, this leads in 1572, 1573 to the composition of the first poem by a Muslim poet, a man called Mudalli Sheikh Ishaq, or better known by his pen name, Vanaparimala Pulavar. He composes a poem which, in its full title, is called Ayra Masala Puranam. It's generally known as the Ayra Masala or the Thousand Questions. And it's 1095 quatrains. It's a pretty long poem about questions that were asked to the Prophet Muhammad by a Jewish scholar. And in the end, the Jewish scholar, through these questions, recognizes that the Prophet Muhammad truly is a prophet, and he and his followers convert to Islam. It's a well-known story in the Middle East. We have Latin versions of it. We have Persian versions of it. It's very popular in Indonesia. There's a very good book about this poem and the text by a scholar called Roni Ricci. This is the content of the poem. It was composed in Madurai, as I said, in 1572. And this, in a sense, kicks off this tradition of writing in Tamil, using Tamil poetic traditions about Islamic subjects by Muslims. Now, the kind of writings we have from the late 16th century onwards can roughly be divided into 3 to 4 kinds of texts. The first, and by far the most numerous in a sense, or at least the longest, are texts that actually come under this label of literature with a capital L. So within that body of texts, we have roughly 3 kinds of literary texts. The first and the most famous ones are long narrative poems, which are about the life and deeds of prophets, most importantly the Prophet Muhammad, and various Muslim saints. And they are in a genre that is sometimes referred to as kapiam or kavya, or as puranam. This is roughly what in Sanskrit and in other Indian languages you would know as a mahakavya. Beside these, we also have other longish narrative poems, but they are not in the typical Tamil quatrains. They are in couplets, and they are of a somewhat more popular and fictional nature. Mostly they are about various campaigns against giants and evil kings that were fought by the prophet's son-in-law. And many of them are not really historical. They are really a little bit more for entertainment. And they are written in a genre that is known in Tamil as amane. And finally, we have lyrical poetry. Most of this is panegyric poetry or hymns addressed yet again to various important religious personalities, sometimes also to contemporaries or to the patrons of poetry. Beside this literature with a capital L, we have another type of writing, which in Tamil is known as Meññana Padal, or Sons of Supreme Knowledge. And this sometimes is referred to by people as Sufi poetry. I put Sufi poetry in inverted commas for the simple reason that when one says Sufi poetry, people have a particular idea in mind of how this looks. And probably the most archetypical Sufi poetry is the poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi. Don't expect this when you look at Tamil Sufi poetry. I will talk about this a little bit later in the talk, but it's something actually a little bit different. And then we have a tradition of writing in prose. Now, usually in Tamil doesn't have a big tradition in the older literature of writing prose. So most of these prose tracts really don't come under the idea of literature. The Sufi poetry still follows most of the rules of literature, but the prose literature is a little bit free for all, where really the didactic part is more important, where people try to communicate points of theology, doctrine, and law. We don't have too many prose tracts, but we do have some, and they become more important, especially in the 19th century. And finally, a very small section of what we have, we can also call oral poetry. So we have a few manuscripts which were apparently penned down to keep to fix what was a local oral tradition of sort of on the spot improvising poetry and improvising narratives, much as you have also in the Hindu context that people in villages would sing ballads of important deities or heroes and so on. And we have 1 or 2 manuscripts, older manuscripts, that sort of seem to fix such oral poetry also in the context of Islam, but it is not a very large percentage of the writing. So this system of what texts are there persists well into the early 20th century. And before I continue now and talk a little bit about the context of the writing, let me give you just very briefly a few very important sort of highlights of that literature. So the first text I want to mention is a poem known as the Miraj Male, or the garland. Male is mala, right? The garland of the Miraj. The Miraj is the journey that the Prophet Muhammad took supposedly one night into heaven. And this is one of the oldest, after this Ayra Masala, this is the oldest poem, Islamic poem in Tamil. It's by a man called Ali Pulabar, and it was written in 1590. And it is so important that not too long ago, there's still a tradition in one place in Tamil Nadu where on the occasion of the night of the Miraj, the older people in the town come together and recite this poem. And one of them actually said to me about the poet Ali Pulavar, he said, Ali Pulavar, Adi Pulavar. Ali Pulavar is the Adi Kavi, the first poet, right? Meaning he's the first real poet in the Islamic tradition because his poem the Aira Masala is a little bit of a didactic poem, but this one is really something that indulges in describing this wondrous journey of the Prophet from earth through the heavens and then meeting God. Then the most famous of all the Islamic Tamil texts is a poem known as the Sira Puranam by a man called Umar Pulavar, and he wrote in about 1700. The work wasn't totally completed. By the time he died, it is even in the form it is in, it's in over 20,000 lines, 5,028 quatrains. And as you can guess from the title, Sira is a biography, and specifically the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. This is exactly what this poem tells you. The third of these long narrative poems that I want to mention is by the man whom I quoted at the beginning, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Labai, whom people actually call the Pulavar Nayakam, the Nayak, the Lord of poets. And one of the poems he wrote is the Futuh Ash-Sham Puranam, and it's a poem about the Muslim conquest of Syria. And with 6,786 quatrains, it's the longest of these Islamic Tamil poems. Then I told you there are these somewhat easier poems, a little bit more fictional and entertaining. And the earliest of that is called Sakun Paraipur. It's by a man called Varisai Muhyiddin Pulavar, written in 1686 or 87. And it's about the defeat of a demonic king of Iraq by the Prophet and by Ali. Then on the lyrical side, we have the Tirupukhar by Qasim Pulavar. Tirupukhar is actually a particular type of writing. And there's a very famous collection of songs called Tirupukhar from the 15th century, which are addressed mostly to Murugan, to the deity Murugan. But this Tirupukhar is addressed to Muhammad, and it's by a Muslim poet written in the midst of the 18th century. And finally, I want to mention the three most important of these Sufi poets that I have mentioned. So conveniently, they're from three different centuries. There's Takalai Pir Muhammad in the 17th century. There's Kotar Nanyar Sahib in the 18th century. And then, very famous because he's actually also read by Hindus in Tamil Nadu, is Kunanguri Mastan Sahib, who wrote at the beginning of the 19th century. So I will not bother you further with titles. I will not ask you in the end to repeat them to me and study them for your exam. But these are, if I'm pushed to tell you a few names, these are the names. So let us start with the people who wrote this poetry, who composed it. Now, from the texts, fortunately, we can tell a lot about who the people were who wrote this poetry, because usually in the preface, they said something about themselves and they said something about the context in which a poem was written. So most of this poetry, as with the Hindu poetry in Tamil, was written by specially trained poets who are known in Tamil as Pulavar. The interesting thing about the Muslim poets is that where we can actually tell where that person was socially located, it turns out that their background was in what you might call a local mercantile middle class. They are not in the top level of the mercantile class, but they come from a well-to-do sort of mercantile background in the cases where we can talk about it. And I'll give you an example in a second. We have also missionary reports that already from the early 18th century that Muslim schools existed where this Tamil poetry was actually taught. And several cases are there in our texts where we actually have father-son pairs. So we have poems composed by a man, and then later we have poems composed by the son of that same person. So we can see poetry somehow ran in the family. It was taught by fathers to their sons, and we have these father-son pairs among the poets. Now, the poets are not the only ones who are important in composing a poem. Very often they express that to do so, they actually collaborated with religious scholars. And in that collaboration, the scholar would actually select sources in Arabic, more rarely in Persian. And then he would do something that in the text is called an urei. An urei is a commentary. But we have some of these written ureis, and actually they are coming very close to being translations, but non-literary translations. Translations simply of the word-by-word meaning of an Arabic text. And then it is the poet's task to actually turn this into aesthetically pleasing Tamil in the manner exactly as that scholar told him. And we have these phrases again and again. I did it exactly as I was told to do it. So there is a claim to being authentic in transmitting this knowledge. So just to give you one example, this is from a poem called the Abu Shahma Male, which was written in 1736. And the poet says, he kind of speaks to himself. Address the elders, child of scholars, who extolled the Tamil language made prosperous by the Lord, of that lovely city, Madurai the thriving, which appeared in the world at the limit of which is a tree. Don't bother yourself with the last sentence. If you want to know something about it, I can explain it later. Sayyida Kadi, this is the name of the poet, whose chest is scented, the son given to Muttu Muhammad, the companion to fortune, recited it well and brought it to the stage. So here the poet, and I've forgotten the most important part, Muttu Muhammad is a fireworks seller. So here we have one of the rare cases where the poet actually tells us, my father produced and sold fireworks, right? In the early 18th century. It's an interesting little reference that I wouldn't have expected so easily. And the other interesting thing that we have here is that he speaks about the Navalar, the scholars, who extolled the Tamil language. And with this, he is obviously referring to a far larger world of Tamil poetry because he identifies them with the city of Madurai. This poem was not composed in Madurai. It was composed in a place called Tirupalai, which is on the Park Strait, so 100, 200 kilometers away from Madurai at least. But the reference here is to Madurai because Madurai in the imagination of Tamil poetry is the birthplace of Tamil poetry. It is where the Madurai Sangam is located, the famous Sangam poetry. And so he actually puts himself here into that wider tradition of Tamil poetry that is connected with the city of Madurai. So this immediately brings us to the question of how does this Islamic literature relate to other Tamil literature or other Tamil literatures? Now, the thing is, we can tell from their poetry that Muslim poets were very obviously schooled in traditional grammar, poetics, and literature. That is clear by the way they use their language. That is clear by the way they use conventions. They even put into their poems references to the important Tamil grammars, such as the Tolkappiyam or the Nannul. These are older grammars. It's like referring to Panini in Sanskrit, right? It's the original old Tamil grammars. We can also see that they have knowledge of the conventions of Tamil literature, and sometimes we can even prove they knew individual verses from important non-Muslim texts. So in a few cases, we can prove that they knew individual verses from the Kamba-Ramayanam, for example, because they create a verse which is very similar, which obviously is in communication with that earlier verse. But at the same time, we have this interesting case. They refer to the grammar works, but there's not a single reference to a non-Muslim work of kavya, of literature, in the text. So they're not saying, oh yeah, there's Kamban and now we are writing something along the lines of Kamban, even though it is pretty clear they knew Kamban, right? But they don't refer to him. Also, nowadays, in the 19th, 20th century, very often you hear stories that a particular Muslim poet was trained by a particular Hindu poet, right? Somehow to explain how he could be so good in Tamil literature. But you will never find this in the poetry. This is never mentioned. When they talk about teachers, it is invariably Muslim teachers, sometimes people from the family of known poets who trained them, right? So there is this question, how do the Muslims actually relate to this wider Shaiva and Vaishnava and Jaina literature? So we can say that there were clearly separate, what we might call literary communities, where certain texts were read and other texts might be read, but they were not necessarily explicitly referred to. And this we can see from the fact that sometimes the boundary is actually expressed in the text. And I'll give you an example very soon. We also find these internal quotations and references to other Muslim texts. So you do find this building up of what you might call a canon of earlier Muslim literature. So for example, the Sira Puranam, after it was written, very soon it starts being mentioned in other poems and people refer to it and say, this is such a fantastic poem and we praise the author of that poem, right? But you don't find a reference to Kamban. You don't find a reference to other important Hindu poets. And what also distinguishes the Islamic literature from the literature written in various Hindu contexts is that we're dealing with a different social class. As I've said, we're talking here almost about what you could call bourgeois literature. I've mentioned this for the poets, and I will mention it again when I talk about the patrons. So Hindu literature was mostly in this time either written at royal courts or it was written at temples, where you have a sort of agrarian elite that engages in it. And this is not true for Muslim literature. But yet, at the very same time, we have these occasional boundary crossings. We have one poem, which is quite famous, called the Sedakadi Nondi Nadakam, which is an Islamic poem, but it is obviously written by a Hindu poet because he mentions his name and his identity in the poem. We have the opposite of a Muslim poet writing Hindu poetry, and I will come to this in a second. And I've already mentioned Gunangudi Mastan Sahib. He is very popular as a Sufi poet, but he's also popular among certain classes of Shaivas because they read his poetry as Shaiva poetry. So there are these occasional boundary crossings. And the interesting thing is that nevertheless, the boundary is actually articulated. And let me give you an example for this. This is by a man called Sayyid Muhammad Anawiya. And we have a couple of Muslim poems that he has written, most importantly, a text called the Ali Nama. So it's a text about Ali. And then at some point, he apparently decided, I've had enough of writing Muslim poetry. I shall now write poetry about the Mahabharata. And he composed several poems about the Mahabharata. But the first one is called the Mahabharata Amane. And in the preface to this poem, he has this interesting statement, because he obviously realizes, I'm writing now for a different audience. I'm not writing for Muslims anymore. I have to tell these people who I am and why am I doing this. And he said, he studied many about himself, right? The he is I. He studied many religions as if they were one. Of the prophet's lineage, he told 10 Puranas in his own religion. So here he's telling people, yes, I'm of a different Samayam, as he says, Samay, a different tradition. But I have studied many, many different traditions, and I know enough to write this Mahabharata. And I'm also a good poet. In my own tradition, I've already written 10 Puranas, so you don't worry, I know what I'm doing, right? But he articulates that there is a boundary that he had to cross in order to write this poem. Now, you have mentioned at the beginning one important thing, and that is that at some point, as Muslims started writing in Tamil, the Arabic script was actually adopted to write Tamil. And in order to do that, they modified it slightly. So they introduced two new vowel signs. They introduced a couple of new consonant letters. Sometimes there are up to 9 new consonant letters in order to make the Arabic script to enable it to write Tamil. And also important, you may know usually the Arabic script doesn't write vowels, but you can write vowels if you want. And that when you write Tamil in Arabic script, almost always you put vowels because you just need them. Now, this tradition is sometimes referred to as Arabi or as Arabic Tamil or Arabic Tamil. And the origin of it, I suspect, we have no proof of this, may have lain in bilingual manuscripts. So if you want to write Arabic, first and foremost, you have to think about what writing material do I have? If I have a palm leaf, it becomes next to impossible to write Arabic script. But if I have paper, I might want to write Arabic script, and I might actually want to write something in Arabic. And then I want to write something in Tamil. And then you get into a problem because the Arabic goes one way and the Tamil goes the other way. So if you actually want to translate the Arabic into Tamil, and we have such manuscripts, then it is far easier to write the Tamil also in the Arabic script, because then at least you just have one script and you can just interweave the two languages, right? So the interesting thing is most people, when they see that Tamil was written in the Arabic script, they start to think, oh, Muslims try to be separate. They try to have their own thing. That Arabic Tamil tradition is somehow different from this general Islamic Tamil tradition. Right? And that, interestingly enough, is not the case. The choice of script, we can see this through many manuscripts and printed books. The choice of script was largely pragmatic. That is, what kind of paper do I have? What kind of writing material do I have? Which script do I know? Right? Interestingly enough, it seems that women, for example, were more likely to know the Arabic script until the 20th century than to know the Tamil script. So for them, if they wanted to write, this was the natural choice. Right? And we can tell this by the fact that we have manuscripts of the same texts written in different scripts. We also have later prints of the same text written in different scripts. And we don't have these terms Arabi or Arabic Tamil before basically the early 20th century. We sometimes find these words, Arabi, and very rarely also Arabic Tamil. But they're always used to refer to Tamil in general, to the language. not to any particular separate tradition of writing. So there is no evidence prior to the 20th century that this was in any way considered to be a turn away from Tamil, right? It was just pragmatically, you had both scripts, and sometimes you used one, sometimes you used the other, sometimes you used even both in the same manuscript. We sometimes have that as well. Now, the important part really for all this writing and all this literature is that it was paid, right? You would have none of this literature, or very little, if there weren't individuals in Tamil Nadu at some point who were ready to pay money to somebody to compose a big poem on the life of the Prophet Muhammad and then have themselves mentioned somewhere in the poem as the person who gave the money. Sascha Eberling has talked about this as an economy of praise. That is, the better and more developed the poem is, the higher cultural capital is accrued by the patron. And of course, the more the patron has to pay the poet, right? And you can see an example of this, very beautiful example on the right-hand side. This is an inscription from 1824 about the foundation of a mosque. This is in Gaul in Sri Lanka. And apparently when they built that mosque, they asked this Sheikh Abdul Qadir, whom I've now mentioned several times, they wrote to him and said, we want a poem about this. And he apparently sent this poem, which is in a very complex meter. And it was engraved on this stone slab on the side built on a side building in the mosque compound. So this is just one example of such a mention of the patron. To narrate on earth in Tamil, the Kanakabhisheka Male, this is one poem about the Battle of Karbala, so that the beauty of the 8 lords of scripture, starting with the prophet, may persist in the world. Syed Kondala Khan of Madurai, sage of great merits, gave much gold, right? And that was the really important sentence. Now, we can tell from these mentions that the patrons of Islamic literature were primarily of a mercantile and rarely of a military background. They were not in themselves royalty, but in many cases we know they were politically active in the kingdoms in which they lived. And so we have a few early centers of Muslim patronage, most importantly the city of Madurai, which at that time was the capital of the Madurai Nayakas, whose army had a large percentage of Muslims. And these Muslims from the army were apparently in Madurai the people who financed the literature. And on the fishery coast, that is the lowest, southernmost part of the East Coast, and there it is more pearl merchants, rich overseas merchants that actually pay for this poetry. Now, the interesting thing, and in the 18th century, this slowly grows. It goes a bit to the north into the Kaveri Delta, and it goes into the kingdom of Travancore. But the interesting thing is that we find Islamic Tamil literature prior to the 19th century only in kingdoms where Tamil was a court language. So the paradoxical situation is that the Nawabs of our court, basically the representatives of the Mughal emperor in 18th century Tamil Nadu, they didn't finance a single Tamil Muslim poem, right? So the only Muslim rulers around not only didn't support this literature, actually when the Nawabs of our court conquer Madurai, Muslim literary activity in Madurai ceases in Tamil. Right? Because the Nawabs of Arcot had no interest in Tamil. They financed mostly Persian and occasionally Urdu poetry. At the same time, slowly, the audiences of this poetry, even though they didn't write it themselves, the audiences started to extend beyond this zone to northern Tamil Nadu, and interestingly enough, also to Southeast Asia and to Sri Lanka. So already by the first decade of the 19th century, we have British reports from what is now Malaysia about Muslims living there, Tamil Muslims, who read this kind and recite this kind of poetry. And we have a very interesting thing in one of the main libraries in Germany. There are manuscripts of important poetic treatises in Tamil, which were used to train poets. And these manuscripts come from the personal collection of a Muslim who was resident in Indonesia. So you can see how these texts even spread to Southeast Asia. Let me very briefly, to round this up, also talk about the fact that There was, after all, also literature that wasn't written with the promise of worldly remuneration, but that was written basically for the love of God. And that is what I've called this Sufi poetry. This is religious poetry concerning religious knowledge and usually esoteric knowledge. It has usually no patron. It uses a lot of musical and dramatic genres, which are a bit different from the genres used in the more el literary tradition. And it's more important, really, which poet, which author, which Sufi writes these poems than how they are located, so to say, in connection to any important patron. And this writing is particularly interesting because there's a lot of overlap with Saiva Hindu religious poetry in the terminology and the imagery. And I'll give you an example in a second. Similarly, in the same vein, this prose theological writing happens without patronage. Now, here the aims are clearly didactic, wanting to teach certain things for people who do not know Arabic. And this is written in a style of literature that is not, or in a style of writing that is not literature, that is very explicitly seen as something that is not ilakiam, not kavya, but commentarial prose. There is a lot of textual and social overlap between the genres, between the audiences, in a few cases also between the poets. So just to give you a feel for this, this is from a text, and here already you will marvel at the title of the text, the Veda Purana, by a man called Nuh the Elder. And this is a really intriguing compendium on Muslim religion. And in one chapter, we find this verse. Lo, moon, sun, and the gold flashing stars appear outside. It's the night of power. When attending to the three holy lights as one, joining them together, they are hurled into the great vortex. Listen to the scripture of Allah in the imagination as grounding. What this does is it combines Muslim references such as the night of power, the scripture of Allah, and so on, with a form of meditative practice that is actually based on yoga. And earlier in the same chapter, he has outlined the chakras. He has given a description of the body as you know it from yoga. And the three holy lights, of course, are the three fires that are in the human body, which you are supposed to bring together and cast into that great vortex, as he calls it. So this is really a combination of yoga practice with a particular type of Muslim meditation, you might say. Now, here we are at the edge of the 19th century. And with the 19th century comes a somewhat changing economy of writing for Muslims. The most important thing that happens in the 19th century is that printing is introduced into the equation. The first print of a Muslim text in Tamil is a print of the Sira Puranam, printed by, yet again, this Sheikh Abdul Qadir Labai, who was a poet, in 1842. That's the first Tamil Islamic printed book. Now, over the next decades, there's a development of something you can call a Muslim print economy in Tamil. We have Muslim texts printed by both Muslims and non-Muslims. And in many cases, these older poetic traditions are printed, and they are apparently quite successful because in a number of cases, we have 4 or 5 editions in the 19th century itself. So this is something that really starts spreading this tradition of writing actually even further. In addition to that, we have new textual production. We have new poems being printed. And now, interestingly enough, they lean not so much towards these long Mahakavya Puranam poems. They're leaning more towards the lyrical. And they get in new imagery, new topics. We'll give you an example again in a moment. There's also new religious prose, and that, at least in the beginning, in, let's say, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, is published usually in the Arabic script. But from the early 20th century onwards, also in the Tamil script. This is also the time when we get the first complete translations of the Quran. And before 1910, these were always in the Arabic script. In fact, the first translation that uses the Tamil script, you see it here on the right-hand side, that still had a note that said, please don't give this book to non-Muslims. If non-Muslims get this and they read the translation of the Quran, they will use it to attack us. They will use it to make fun of our religion. So don't give it to them, right? Preferred use was the Arabic script. And then only from the 1920s onwards, Quran translations came to be published mostly in the Tamil scripts. Finally, we also have newspapers and journals which were published by Muslims. So this is a very rich, actually, textual tradition. It was undergirded by new modes of financing. So not one big patron, but actually people coming together and subscribing so that a book could be published. And we finally also find new centers of production, not only within Tamil Nadu, but we now have a good deal of Muslim publishing in Ceylon, in Burma, and in the Straits settlements. That means in Malaysia and in Singapore, of Islamic literature in Tamil. And all this is supported by something I mentioned in the last talk, namely that Tamil Muslims already at that time show a relatively high rate of literacy. So in 1901, the rate of literacy among Tamil Muslim men stood at about 30% who were literate. Whereas at Muslim men in India as a whole at that time were only 6% literate. And also Hindus in Tamil Nadu weren't as literate in Tamil as Muslims were. This is something the British regularly bring up. And of course, this undergirded the success of such a printing economy. So one example, the final example actually of poetry that was composed in that period, and this was a poem that describes a journey made by the poet to the city of Singapore and the city of Johor in Malaysia. And he says, give me a second. Si Kuala Salat, called Pulau Brani. Those of you who know Singapore, Pulau Brani is where the harbor is in Singapore. The beauty of the blossoms in the flowering gardens, and on the height of the Black Hill, the mausoleum of the late Turkish consul. That mausoleum is also still there. Passing Kampong Brani, we may, with enthusiasm, get into a coach of the tramway espied before, and obtain a glimpse of Sayyid Nuhu Ali's holy dargah. So this is a description of Singapore, but written not as a prose text, but in traditional poetic style. And we have a lot of such poems written in the colonial period, you might say. And this brings me to the very last slide, and then I'm also done. What about Islamic or Muslim literature now? Because the interesting thing that happens is what I call the paradox of the 20th century. While Muslim religious writing expands between World War I and independence, literary writing starts to contract, and it continues mostly in the old models, right? And the problem a little bit is that something happens that wasn't there before. Earlier, every community within the Tamil region would write its own literature. Shaivas would write their own literature, Jains would write their own literature, Vaishnavas would write their own literature, and similarly, Muslims would do so. Now, successively, Muslims as well as anyone else gets integrated into a common Tamil identity, along with schooling and all the kind of secular education that comes with it. So the Arabic script more or less disappears by the 1930s to be used. And that leaves Muslims with no real role but to write religious texts. But they can, of course, contribute generally to Tamil literature, but then there's nothing specifically Islamic or Muslim in that. So it really takes a while before Muslims come to find a subject to write about that is really the experience of being a Muslim within Tamil Nadu, a sort of social novel that, and social writings, short stories, poetry, that address specific problems, situations of Muslim society. And the first writer to really become famous beyond the Muslim audience to do that was a man called Topil Muhammad Miran, who won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1997. Most of his texts were written in the 1980s and 90s. And one of his novels is actually among the novels I translated into German. So he's really the first person who gets picked up as somebody who can bring Muslim society to a wider sort of audience in Tamil Nadu. Now, since Topil's literature became better known, we have had a number of important Muslim writers. And among these, I want to point out two women because they are particularly important in their critical engagement with Muslim society in Tamil Nadu. One of whom is Salma, whom you see on the picture here, who has written not only very important novels and poetry, but who is also very politically engaged. And she's a member of the Rajya Sabha. So she's a member of parliament in India. She's very much into politics. And again, something I said at the end of my last talk also. You might say Tamil Muslims. This is something I've never heard of. But when you actually look, you find people like Salma, who's a member of parliament. You find people like President Abdul Kalam. You find A.R. Rahman, etc. You find actually quite a lot of famous Tamil Muslims who are very engaged in wider public life in India. And the other person I want to mention is Sharmila Sayed, who is from Sri Lanka. Again, wrote novels and poetry, and she's so threatened in Sri Lanka, she got death threats that she's now living in the United States. So there is also a pushback against this critical engagement with Muslim society. But yet, I would say there is a very, how would I say, uh, there's a very good outlook for further Muslim writing in Tamil, and I'm sure we will have far more authors contributing to Tamil literature in the near future, bringing their very specific experiences of their society into a wider conversation. And with this, thank you very much for your patience, and I'm open for your questions.
Thank you so much. That was such a well put together presentation. And of course, at the first level, I am gobsmacked by the depth of your knowledge and the range of your command over the multiple languages that you have, sort of shown so beautifully. I feel embarrassed that your Tamil is far better than what would be mine. So thank you so much. Tell us a little bit about, give us an insight into what made you pursue this topic, and tell us a little bit about your research process as well. We'd like to know you a little bit.
Mm. Okay, this is, I need to see that I keep that very short. Basically, how did I come to the topic? Um, I was, there were sort of two things that came together. One was that when I was 14, 15, I started getting very much interested in India. And I started getting interested very much in South India for reasons that sound naive to myself so I'm not going to repeat them now. But that was one thing. On the other hand, in school, I had a lot of friends who were of Turkish background. So I had a lot of interaction with Muslims. And when I started studying, and I ultimately decided to study Tamil, I, of course, had to at some point start thinking, well, what would I like to study when I study Tamil? And the uh, I started reading histories of Tamil literature, and occasionally these mentions came up. Usually it is Umar Pulawar and Kunangudi Mastan Sahib. There's a mention, there is a small Muslim literature. Some things are there. And I started looking around in our library in the university where I was studying, which, at least at that time, and I maybe even now, claimed to be the largest collection of Tamil books in Europe. Um, and I came across quite a lot of books about this subject and realized this is not such a small amount of literature. This is actually quite a lot. And yeah, that sort of pushed me then into saying, okay, I'll look into this, and I want to study this. And then what happened basically was I was in India then, and with a few friends started talking I went to Muslim bookshops and tried basically to get a copy of the Sira Puranam. That was my first sort of aim. And by chance, this brought me into contact with a man known as Hassan, Syed Muhammad Hassan. He was an editor for a long time of a Muslim journal in Tamil called Muslim Murassil. He was a very important person in the literary community, and he had published a lot of re-editions of the older literature, and he owned a lot of old books. He was very old already at the time, but he was extremely kind. And when I expressed the interest, he borrowed books he loaned me books. He gave me books for free, which he had copies of. When I was interested in a particular book, he started asking around where I could get it. And the nice thing also was he expected that I work, right? So I remember there was a particular poem, and by chance I'd come across it. I'd started reading it, and some of the things that were written about this poem didn't work out in my mind, right? Something was off. So at first I asked him, so I've been starting reading this poem, and this is by this poet, right? And he said to me, yes, it's by this poet. And I said, but the poem mentions something that that poet could not have known in the 17th century, right? And I could see the smile on his face. He said, yes, we must say that either that passage or the whole book as a whole is not by the poet, it just claims to be by it. But he didn't tell me that outright, right? He wanted me to find it myself. So, yeah, the research process has basically been because despite the fact that many of these texts were actually ultimately printed and they are printed editions and they were also reprinted and um, I have been able to collect the texts only slowly over time. And as one collects, one starts reading them. This is a process of increasing fine-tuning of what one becomes interested in. And I was particularly interested in that kind of social context in which this poetry was written. So from now, when I get a new text now, the first thing I do is read the preface because that is usually where people tell what the social context is. But it's really a sort of mix and match that has come together. And the last thing I should say with this is I came to this Arabic Tamil, which I knew nothing about, and which I heard first about from this gentleman. And yeah, I basically by chance in 1999, in that shrine in Nagpur, that Dargah, in one of the bookshops there, I found a book which was a commentary of one poem from the 19th century. And the poem was there in the Arabic script and in the Tamil script as well. So then I started teaching myself the Arabic script, and I ultimately wrote an MA about that poem. And the funny part is, 2 years back, in Germany, I was at a function where I was invited as a speaker, and the guest of honor was the honorable consul for India in Frankfurt. And it turned out that this gentleman was the grandson of the man who wrote that commentary I had written my MA about. And I had actually met his father by chance 2 years earlier, didn't know that they were connected. So, yeah, it's a lot of chance encounters that have come together.
How amazing, how amazing. And like Lakshmi Raman is saying that Tamil is one of the most difficult languages, and she speaks it only learning it in her 30s, and you learning both these languages along with the others that you know is really, really very, very impressive. And Lakshmi also has another question. Do you have other instances of Muslim women writing in Tamil before the 20th or the 21st century?
Yes, of course. There are, if you mean specifically the Muslim context, we do have a few women, interestingly enough, under these Sufi poets, right? So not among the poets who would have been financed by a patron and who would have spoken in public and so on. But we have two, three Sufi poetesses. Uh, Bit difficult to date, but probably around 1800. There's a lady called Rasul Bibi. There is another who has a name which you would never identify as Muslim, but she is Muslim, Kachi Pillai Amar. And then a bit later in the 19th century, you have Sayyid Asiya Ummah. So, yes, you do have earlier women writing, and you do have it, of course, also in the Hindu tradition. You have the famous Andal, of course, Karakalamayar. Not too many, but they're there.
Yes, as Sabira says, your meeting these people was like the old adage: when the student is ready, the master appears, the teacher appears. It really does. Sheikh, would you like to put your question in the chat so I can address it to him, please? Yeah, it was interesting to see that uh, the Muslim leaders, I mean the Nawabs of our court were not sort of writing. So somewhere the bond of language seems to be better than the bond of religion, is
Mm,
what I sort of observed. And you find that in Tamil Nadu for sure, where the love for Tamil is very strong and
mhm.
perhaps a little bit more than religion, which is a
Yeah.
great sign. Yes.
I'm important to see is really that language has a status, and what has the status is not the language per se. What has the status is the literature. So people have a positive sort of feel towards a particular literature and think that this is really what should be done and which shows your skills. And for the Nawabs of Arcot, who basically came from Awadh, the two languages they were familiar with and which they cherished were Persian and Urdu. And to a certain degree, that's understandable, right? That you have a similar thing. The Nayakas, the Madurai Nayakas, had a great attachment to Telugu. They didn't quite push Tamil and other languages out, but Telugu still is one of the prime languages for them. The same, the Maratha rulers of Tanjore, they brought Marathi into the equation in South India. So it is always, we have to be a bit careful. Our modern language identity politics, which, as you say very correctly, are very strong in Tamil Nadu. They're also very strong in a few other states of India. These politics are something rather modern, very much as the kind of religious politics we have are very modern because the politics is modern, right? So this is a politics not about, oh, we are friends with everyone who is a speaker of Persian, Tamil, whatever. We are supporting those people who can do literary things with these languages. That is really what is important here. They wouldn't have cared about some farmer speaking Persian. They cared about a particular style of Persian or a particular style of Tamil.
Well said. Well said. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Both your talks put together give us such a good insight into the Tamil language and the Muslim sort of identity there and the literature there. Thank you very much again. It has been a pleasure to have you at Khaki. Thank you to our audience for your presence this Saturday, and see you all next Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.